Assalamu alaikum, my name's Ryan. I'm from Sheffield in the United Kingdom and I'm 20 years old. I can remember my first day at school, in primary school, because it was my brother's first day in secondary school as well. So I remember going to school and like him in his new uniform and stuff. And I remember my mum weaving me and stuff. I can remember that from primary school, and that was my first memory probably. And I remember being a bit apprehensive because it's your new first day at school, sort of away from your mum, and that's my first memory of primary school. I've got a quite good relationship with my mother and father. I can remember when I was little, I've always been a bit of a mummy's boy, so I can remember sort of a bit. It's a bit like a game, me and my mum versus my dad a bit. And so not like a gang as such, but that was always sort of the thing. It sounds a bit worse than it is. Like obviously I was still friends with my dad, but like for joking about, me and my mum sort of used to like gang up on my dad a bit because like he'd sort of. I remember like when I was little, he'd sort of pretend to he'd put a fist up to my mum, and just to get me annoyed, and I'd sort of go and try and get him and stuff. So I can. It was very nice. I had a very nice childhood. And because my brothers and sisters, they're much older than me. My brother's 28. My brother's 27, sorry. And my other two sisters are 29 and 30, so they're quite much older than me. And my mum always called them the kids. So they were sort of like, they were a bit, because they're much older, they sort of took on a semi-parental role. And that's how, so like when there's my brothers and sisters, but I see there's sort of authority, if that makes sense, because they're much older. There's sort of a semi-authority. So that's how sort of the family structure is. My brother, he's sort of, I don't know the best way to phrase it is, but he's a bit because obviously he's much older. He sort of, when my dad wasn't there, he sort of took on a much more authoritarian role, because like my dad's quite laid back. But my brother, he's like, if he wants me to do something, he'll come down quite hard on me, so to speak. So that's I've kind of grown up with that sort of, not to mess with my brother, because it's fine. Like I can joke about with him, but like there's a certain, he's got a kind of authority. And my sisters, I'd say they were kind of more, because they weren't as. My brother's sort of, I think my brother's not an apprentice, so to speak, but my brother's he's sort of taken under his ring, so to speak. Whereas my sisters, they've taken a more, not a standoff role as such, but they've been a bit more. I don't see them as having an authority. Like I wouldn't say my brother's got an authority, but I don't see them as having like sort of a authoritative role over my behaviour. So that's what I've grown up with. I've sort of grown up with, because they're much older. I was the young one, and then it was sort of like a hierarchy. So there was me, and then my brothers and my sisters, and then my parents as the final authority. But they're sort of the mid ground, because I can tell my brothers and sisters, like not now obviously, but beforehand when I do sort of things that you shouldn't be doing, I could tell my brothers and sisters, because they're sort of powy, and they'd like put me in line if it was something really bad, so it's sort of like a preliminary. It's sort of like a preliminary. It's hierarchy, so that's sort of what I've grown up with really. I remember being quite nervous because like at primary school, I was everyone knows me because it was quite a small primary school. It's probably only like 200 or 300. There was probably about 20 in each class, and there was obviously only 7 years. So everyone knew me. And obviously when you go to it's sort of the analogy of a big fish in a small pond and then a small fish in a big pond. So it was quite, obviously you've got to adapt to that. And I remember being quite nervous about it, as you are really. And on the first day, I sort of, I overcompensated because I'm built quite little, and I've grown. Obviously, I'm not so little now, although I'm still quite little. But when I was younger, I was really little, so I sort of had to overcompensate for it, and I'd try and sort of I'd do things to get me popular. Like I'd behave up in class. I'd do things like this just to make, obviously because I'm little. It was probably, I can only sort of rationally think about it now, but subconsciously it was probably sort of a defence mechanism. And even in secondary school as well, I didn't really stick with a group of friends. I think in secondary school I can count 5 or 6 different groups I'd hang about with. So I was I didn't have a stable sort of group of friends until I got to about 15, and then obviously it's when you're leaving school, and I'd sort of built relationships properly. But throughout secondary school I didn't really properly build a proper friendship with anyone because I always had sort of a defence barrier. My parents, in terms of rules and boundaries, they set boundaries, but I wouldn't say I was hanging about with bad people, but I was hanging about with people who didn't have that. So I'd sort of, shamefully, ignoring them's a strong word, but I'd sort of treat them a bit, sort of, like, there were guidelines, but they weren't definite. In terms of, like, drugs and things, they're very sort of harsh against drugs, but not with alcohol. So I suppose, in terms of boundaries, they set them, but I saw them as guidelines as opposed to definite, like, strict boundaries, whereas they probably set them as definites. Whereas I was going out, I was staying out late-ish, because they set me boundaries for like 9 o'clock and I'd stay out till like 10:30. So that's, and they'd tell me off, but not severely. It'd just sort of be a slight reprimandment where, when you're a teenager, I sort of was like, oh, well, if that, you sort of, you learn by punishments and rewards, or at least I did. So because I couldn't see a punishment as such, I'd think, oh well, it's not that bad, so I can continue to do that. My parents, they're not very religious really. They do Christmas, it's sort of typical British family. They celebrate Christmas, they like Easter eggs, etc., etc. But they're not very. They don't sort of have a connection with God. But my auntie, she's very religious. She's a Christian. So there's sort of been an outward religious kind of thing, but I never took notice of it because my family are quite passive about it. And if you sort of bring up religious sort of things, they think, oh, here we go again, or not, or at least that's how it seemed to me. I may have inflated it myself. However, that's the impression I got. So my auntie was sort of, my auntie's very religious. She's a Christian. She goes to church every Sunday. She takes part in like church community activities and things. So there's been so I've known a significant amount about Christianity. But in terms of my parents, there wasn't much religion in the house at all. No. I remember one time when I'm not sure how old I was. It must have been when I was about 8 or 9. Because it's a bit of a vague memory, it's not like vivid. And I can remember going to this thing where, I'm not sure what it's called, but you go to church and you have like oranges with candles in. And I remember going to that one time, my auntie took me, and I think my brothers and sisters went as well. And because it's not a vivid memory, I can't remember much, but I just remember being in sort of a dark hall with an orange and a candle in it. And that's like the only thing I can sort of remember in terms of religious rituals, and in terms of
going to church, maybe.
Yeah, I didn't. I think I went to Sunday school a couple of times, but I'm not. I'm not sure, and I can't remember. That's the thing, because I think I've been, but I'm not 100%. But I can remember sort of going to church on occasions, like funerals, weddings, etc. But in terms of like organised sort of regular times to go, there wasn't really anything as such. So it's quite an irreligious household. There's no strict guide. My parents call themselves Christian, but that's just the name, because they don't like strongly believe in a deity. I can remember going to my nan's funeral, and it was in church, and the typical sort of hymns, the speech that the vicar does, but I wasn't sort of listening as such. I wasn't really fussed because my parents don't really care if there's a God or not. So that had sort of been not inflicted, that's the wrong word, but that had sort of been passed on to me, where I was apathetic about it. But I remember being in church for funerals, and just because there's cremations, and I remember just the curtains closing. So that's the only sort of vivid memory I have of funerals. Obviously, when you're obviously around 2001 and such, Islam was all over the news. But in terms of sort of meeting Muslims, there was one in my secondary school, but it's sort of a very homogenous area where I live in. It's very white, and there was only one. I think there was only 3 Muslims in the school, and I only had a couple of conversations, so nothing to really learn anything. It wasn't even about religion or anything. It was just like, hello, how are you, etc. But in terms of friends, the friends that I had, they were Muslim by name. Like I met them in drinking places, going out to like bad places. So they weren't very religious at all. And until I sort of got to college, and so that was in college. And until I sort of got to about 17, I didn't really know anyone who who was quite religious. And then there was only 1 or 2 people who I'd have conversations with here and there, but not discussing religion or anything. But when I got to about 17ish, I was, I got in I had a group of friends, where we sort of, this is where I sort of did things like do drugs and drink quite a bit, and I remember in terms of that was the sort of being around them sort of people and having them sort of experiences. I wouldn't say it opened my mind, because it doesn't open your mind, but it sort of opened a sort of, because the things that you're told, you realise that they're not necessarily how they are. So that sort of opened my eyes to think, well, this isn't how everything is said. Then what about other things? And I sort of got very. Obviously, you go through phases. And I remember being an anarchist at one point, quite passionately, and a communist as well. So it was sort of like going through phases that you do, and trying to sort of find not a purpose as such, but sort of trying to find a set thing where you can stay with it, and then that's it. And strongly believe something as well, because I think everybody needs something that you strongly believe in, just to sort of ground you, and to have a base as well, where you need boundaries for yourself as a human being. So these were sort of, even though they were political philosophies, it was sort of trying to shape my values in a sort of wider context of society, as opposed to individual, because everyone has individual values, like you don't kill people, you don't beat people up, you don't steal. But in terms of wider societal values, I got sort of thinking, like, well, how do you fix, because you see problems in society like violence, murder, like injustice, like poor people, when there's people with lots and lots of money. So, and it sort of got me. So from then, I was thinking, how can we fix society, and how can, as opposed to an individual level of I can get through life, I was thinking, well, what philosophy and what doctrine can help everybody. It sounds a bit like sort of a heroic thing, but I wasn't really doing anything. It was just sort of my thinking, what's the best way and what's the best philosophies to sort of get rid of the problems we have in society, as well as just in general how people can live well with one another. Because what Islam says as well is that everything, you've got to start on yourself before you can start on other people. And I didn't have that, because I went from thinking about myself and not really a disregard for other people, and then I went to the other extreme of how can what's the solution for humanity and how everyone's problem's going to solve, when that's not realistic. So it was a shift of how did we get rid of the societal problems, and I was looking for a philosophy from that. A lot of people, when they get like into an idea, it's by a person, whereas I'd heard of the idea and I researched the idea. And communism on paper, it's everybody earns the same, everybody gets what they want, there's no poor people, and it sounds great because when you're sort of like 17, you're going through like the growing up stage anyway, so you don't think of really, you're sort of very idealistic about the way things are, and it's a great ideal, but it's not realistic. But I was looking at the idea of how great it is that everyone's fine and everyone can get by, everyone gets on with each other, and a doctor will work for the same as a cleaner. And it's unrealistic. So I was focused with the idea, but not as the people. As like a lot of people, they get inspired by human beings who are part of that. But I wasn't really into that as such. In terms of researching and sort of learning about different religions, I found with the political philosophies that they weren't very, because you can sit there and you can say everything, but there's nothing incumbent on you to do the things, and it's very, there's no inner aspect to how you can sort of get that, which every human being needs. So I got a book on all sorts of different philosophies, all sorts of religions, philosophies, well, different books actually. I dismissed Christianity already because in this society, religion is generally in this society is quite hostile, and Christianity can be disproved, and it's not very logical either without sort of going too much into it. So I dismissed that, but I was sort of focused on Eastern religions like Buddhism, on Taoism, on these are other religions like Chinese sort of Eastern religions, and as well as Islam. But I found I did an eliminatory process, so to speak. If something didn't match up, I'd think, well, that's not for me. I'll leave that alone. And with the sort of Chinese, sort of Far Eastern religions, it's values to live by, but there's nothing spiritual. Like with Taoism, from what I read anyway, there were shamans and who did magic. And with Buddhism, there's no God either, and there's no outward influence. It's just this, and I found that, and also there has to be in my mind there had to be some external force. Like for a while, I was a deist, which is that God created everything and He's left everything alone. So everything that's going to happen has already happened, and it's not an active God basically. He created everything and then left it. So I was like this for a long time, but not actively or anything. I wasn't very spiritual. That was just sort of an idea, and it was essentially an eliminatory process where I eliminated a lot. I was reading about them all at the same time as well, and what I liked about some religions, I found they were in Islam anyway, but except they were more emphasised in Islam. And the more I read about Islam, there wasn't any. The only proofs, the only things that they could have against it was, oh, there's no God, there's no, it's just rubbish. There wasn't any actual real proof against it. It was sort of opinions that people don't like about it. And as I researched more into it, it seemed to make sense. It sounds cliche, it sounds really cliche, but it seems to it's an all-encompassing religion because it covers everything. Like it covers it gives you obligations that help everybody. And the interesting thing is though, whilst I was sort of researching, and it got to a point where I'd sort of abandoned everything else because everything, as I said, everything that was in other religions that I liked, it was in Islam, but it was emphasised more. And I think every Muslim has to research other religions just to see how magnificent the gift that we've got from Allah, because everything that you like in other things that you may think you like, it's already here for us, but it's better. But back to it, as I was like sort of researching as well, when I was 17, I was doing very haram things, but I came back to them when I was sort of 19, because what had happened was because I got into, when I was 17, I met new people and I was hanging about with them, but my old friends, when they were 19, they were just getting into that. So it was sort of coinciding. I was reading more and more about Islam, and it was also, I was researching Islam for about 9 months. After I'd eliminated a lot of the other religions quite early on, and then my main focus was just reading about Islam to see if it was the religion of God. And the more I read about it, I was reading books that I'd been given. There's a lot of research online because there's an abundance of material, even though it's very sort of Salafi orientated. The core principles of sort of Tawheed and the prophethood, that's there. So the more that made sense to me already, but it was just a case of is it true? Because the other religions, like Judaism believes in one God and they believe in prophets, but it was how is this not the advancement but the continuation of those religions, and it was reading more and more about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how he was with people, just about his mannerisms, and how even under the worst oppression that we can imagine, he didn't. There's an example from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he was preaching the message, and then the Quraysh, they said, "We'll give you everything, just stop preaching it," and he didn't. And that was a very poignant moment, because that proved that he wasn't doing it for the sake of what people would say. Like, he was doing it, like some people say religion is a controlling mechanism, whereas he would, if that was the case, he would have taken what he needed and then controlled the people. But that wasn't what he was about. And also in the Quran, there was an article I read, and it was about the scientific miracles in the Quran, and obviously the one about the progression of the fetus in the womb, and also things about that the barriers in the seas. There's no way for I don't want to sound disrespectful, but there's no way a man 1400 years ago can know anything like this. And that was another thing, that this book wasn't from Earth. It was from an exterior place. Or it was external. It came from an external place, and because these things can't be known, it's just simply they can't be known. And also, the more you read it, it resonates with you. Like, there's a verse for everything, and there's no way a man over the space of 23 years can possibly at all do this, and for it to last and resonate with the human being for as long as it has. So, and that was another thing. It was realizing that the book of Allah was not from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was from another place. It was from Allah. I was very much at a crossroads kind of thing, because I'd watched a lecture on the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and something that was said made me cry. So by that point, I'd already sort of gone past the threshold. I was not technically, but I believed in myself that I was a Muslim, but I was also living a sort of haram lifestyle ish, not terribly so, but I was doing things here and there, and it was coming to very much sort of a crossroads, and I had to decide at some point, because I kept putting it off, because I'd already decided, and I kept putting it off, thinking, oh, I'll do this later, but there comes to a point where I don't know how long I'm going to live. I could die tomorrow, you could die tomorrow, anyone could die tomorrow, and if I died in that state, then I wouldn't be a Muslim. I hadn't said my shahada, so that was me done. So I had to get to a point where I'd not frighten myself, but realise the reality of what was going to happen if I didn't do it soon. And then eventually I was like, enough's enough, and I took my shahada. I took my shahada in the masjid with a couple of brothers, and they were all right, yeah, and then we went out for some food afterwards. I recognised that there was different sects almost immediately because it was around the time of the Mawlid of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And then I heard people saying this is an innovation, this isn't an innovation. So I'd already realised by then there was quite a significant split. This was almost immediately, like literally about a week after. So then I'd realised that there was sort of different paths to choose. When you're very new, the Salafi religion. It's very simple, and it's because they don't follow anybody. They just say if you can find something that disproves somebody who's studied all their lives, then you go with that and ignore that. So that's for someone who's new. That's very easy. And also the people who shout the loudest get heard, and they're the ones who shout saying innovation. This is shirk. This is bid'ah, and etc. etc. And when you're new, you're just concerned about being safe because there's a numerous hadith about the penalties of innovation and setting up partners to Allah, and so you just want to be safe. So I wasn't Salafi, but I was leaning ish that way because it seemed safe, and it's easy to get scared into that sort of idea that nothing, that's it. But I found that it's unspiritual. But at least I found that anyway. I can't speak for everybody, but I found it lacks spirituality for me. Probably about 5 months. It was probably about 4 months later. I was at a lecture, and somebody and the speaker said that Hassan and Hussein they are the leaders of paradise because obviously they're the leaders of the youth, but nobody enters into paradise as an old man. So as soon as I found this out, I was like, who are these people? And I don't understand why there's not a huge focus on them, and how can people be better than these? Obviously, except the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. How can somebody be better than the leader of the people of paradise? So I was, and obviously the school of Ahlul Bayt is very focused, rightfully so, on the guardians of the religion. Naturally I inclined to read about this, but I still had my preconceived idea because I'd been sort of warned away, right? Because I heard things like they've got the Shia, they've got a different Quran, they worship Ali, and they do all this, that, and the other. So I'd sort of not been scared away, but I had this in the back of my mind when researching and asking questions to people, but the more I found out. It was around the time of the martyrdom of Fatima, salamullah alayhi, and so this was obviously I read into this straight away. It was around the time of the martyrdom of Fatima alayhi and salamullah alayhi, and so I read about this, and obviously some companions what they did, I couldn't find a decent. There was no response because even in the books. Even in Sunni books, it says that they went to the door with firewood, but there's no if Fatima is a part of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, then why do you go to somewhere to try and gain allegiance from her? Isn't she right? That was the logic that was in my head, obviously. So I couldn't. There wasn't a decent response for me, and the questions that I was asking because I wouldn't say I was looking to disprove the Shia, but I was trying to find answers that could be put up against it, and the only answers that I was delivered was, "Oh, you're in dangerous land. Don't read into this." So the religion was perfected before the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam died. I got in contact with a friend who was a Shia, and he took me to a majlis, and I went to that. That was actually the majlis of the martyrdom of Fatima salamullah alayhi. So I went to that, and then afterwards we went to the Shia Centre in Sheffield, and I got a book called Peshawar Nights, and I read this book whilst also looking for things to say. I was looking for answers to what this was saying, but I couldn't find any because it's all in Sunni books, and what has happened is it's recorded in everyone's books. And reading this book, I learned more and more, and also before, after I'd realised what had happened to the Prophet's daughter, I was that was enough for me to dismiss that was enough for me to dismiss the religious guidance of these people or any credibility that they have, because for me and for any Muslim really, if the Prophet's daughter is under attack, then there's only one allegiance, because he's from the Prophet. So obviously the credibility of these individuals for me isn't there anymore. So and reading this book as well, and also just trying to find responses from the Sunni Imams that was in Sheffield, I couldn't find any reasonable ones, because they wasn't giving me anything to sort of go with and stay here. So it was becoming more and more evident that there's a cover up somewhere along the line. It's either complicit or it's just ignorance. And obviously, I don't want to. Obviously, not people aren't ignorant. People can go by themselves. I don't want to say that, but there's only, even just scratching the surface, you can see something quite clearly. It's not how it is, and it's not how it's said to be. And also, if everybody was friends and everybody got on, then why, less than 70 years after the death of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how come his grandson is left alone in Karbala, and how come he's got no companions, and the other person has a massive army? This doesn't happen if everybody's friends, because it gets passed down. So clearly, somewhere along the line, something's gone terribly wrong. And all these things, it's too much of a coincidence. And also the arguments, it's either one school is the creation of a Yemeni Jew who would have been dismissed immediately, and also a lot of Shia, the Sayyids. So how can all these people who are descendants from the Messenger, as well as normal people as well, or everybody's normal, but you understand, how come 15% of the entire Muslim Ummah has been taken away by one silly little Yemeni Jew, compared to the other thing, which is the religion has been polluted and manipulated for political power? So it's a no-brainer for me. And then it came to a point again where it was either go with what seems logical, or go with what would be nice to believe. And I came to a point where I had to choose, obviously, the one that the evidence supported and that history supports. So that's when I became Shia. The story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it's hard to comprehend. It took me a while to understand how it all happened, because I don't understand how it does happen to the Prophet's the person who's been sent as a mercy to all mankind. How does 60 years after he has gone, how does his progeny and the guardian of the religion, how does he come under fire from the enemies of Islam? And the first time I read about this, it was very hard to not believe. It was hard to believe almost, because I don't understand how it happens. How can this happen when everybody's friends? How does it happen at all? Anyway, I was mentioning things to Sunni brothers, but they didn't seem to be. So they knew that I was looking into it, and they knew that I was researching history, but they didn't sort of seem bothered by it at all. And I've not really received a negative reaction as such, except obviously when you're in the prayer rooms in public, people come in and they sort of look at you a bit weird. But as far as the people I knew, they're not too fussed. My parents, they've been okay, but they're still a bit they can't understand it quite, because obviously it's to a British family, it's quite strange that somebody will go for a religion that's not Christianity. So understandably it's strange for them, but they've not voiced any concerns as such. But they're still a bit. I can still tell they're a bit sort of uncertain as such, but they're generally fine with it. Alhamdulillah, they're fine with it generally. I'd like to think that when speaking to my parents, I'll bite my tongue a lot more, and I don't answer back as much as, well, I try not to at all. But and also in general I try and do things and I'd be dutiful to my parents. I'm still not as good as I should be. I don't think anybody is, but I've got better. I've noticed myself. I've controlled myself a lot more since. I found it relatively easy to adapt to the prayers. The morning prayer takes some adjusting to, but and it's obviously something you can't. You try to, but even sometimes now I still miss it. May Allah forgive me, but I adjusted to the prayers very easily. In terms of fasting in Ramadan, that was fine because previously when I was researching into it, I fasted a couple of days just to see what it was like. So I sort of didn't know what to expect, but I had a previous experience, so I was relatively. After the first couple of days, obviously everyone feels it quite bad, but that was fine. Well, for me, it's quite simple. I either do them or I don't, and then I'll be judged as such. But in Sheffield, there's not a big Shia community at all, but there's a couple of brothers who I do know, and we sort of hang about in a sort of secure unit. And there's other groups. There's other people in the group. But in terms of, I find it generally, obviously it's difficult. Everybody slips up, but in general, of keeping the Islamic morals, I find that quite easy to do. In the future, inshallah, I'll be studying sociology at university, but I haven't really looked past that as such. I'd like to do something helping people, and sort of community work, but I haven't thought as far as that. I'm just sort of trying to get to university at the minute, and then inshallah after that I'll get a job helping people who are not mentally damaged but have had bad experiences, and to help them through life really.